Now then, this isn't our basement.
No, well spotted, Bax. This is in fact, of course, Newburgh Street, round the back of Carnaby Street, and we're off to meet a fella who happens to be standing over there chatting, who's celebrating his 40th year in this wonderful district. Of course, this is Clobbered, and don't forget, please do follow us on YouTube and subscribe.
Please subscribe.
Mr Powell.
I say you did it.
Hello, this is Clobbered. I'm Mark Webster. He's Mark Baxter.
Hiya.
This one comes with 50% extra mark.
There we go.
Which is Mark Powell sitting over there. Unbelievable joy to be able to say that we're sitting in the basement of his lovely shop in Newburgh Street in the beating heart of Soho. Because, Mark, it's only been the 40 years since you've been knocking about, hasn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's 40 years in June, actually. Exactly June. It'll be 40 years when I opened Powell & Co on Archer Street with Nick, my old partner. We had the shop there only from 85 to 87. It's quite funny how people do tend to pigeonhole you in a time, though.
Right.
You know, even all the writers, everyone else, I loved Archer Street. It was actually only 2 years. You know, and there's so much more happened. That's why it's been good for me to, it's good for me to talk now and talk about my history through all these different phases of the 40 years.
Makes perfect sense, and you're right, and although it's amazing how a short period of time can make such an impact across the years. I want to go back to the start on this one here, which was kind of like where we spend a lot of our time. Where did the suit start? Was it family? Was it films?
It was funny enough, there's a couple of interesting things that I didn't actually think of at the time, and as the years have gone on it made sense. I mean, my mother works in the theatre. She worked for a company called Charles Fox, costumers.
Right.
So she worked in the West End just off of Drury Lane. So until I was born, but then she used to take me back there. So there might have been something with that. My dad was working at a textile company, so he used to get me trouser lengths. So when I was a soul boy, I'd go and get me peg trousers made. But I was actually going to tailors from about 12 or 13 and experimenting with style ideas when I couldn't find particular things that I wanted, whether it be a vintage or second-hand thing, or even a high modernised thing at the time.
Right.
And then I'd get my local tailor to make them for me.
I've seen some photographs of you as a young man.
Yeah.
Still like very into your gear, shirt and tie and nice
from
jacket.
about 18. I mean, I've been through very
younger than that. I've seen younger than that, I think.
I mean, I was into very, very high fashion, and the schoolmates come up here recently, funny enough, when we're doing some filming up here, and he said, well, Mark, even from 11 or 12, you were always about 2 years ahead of everyone else. Yeah. So I was always into my style, and I suppose I was lucky I had an older sister who had been a first generation skinhead, suede head. I was a bit too young to be a skinhead, but I picked up in the suede head smooth period, definitely, for sure.
Yeah.
And funny enough, by the time I was 14, I was dressing better than my brother-in-law, so who was already about 19, 20. So I was right ahead.
You take them small victories, don't you?
Well, you do, because I mean, the other thing is, people are sentimental about, I was this or that in 1975 and 76, but I was only 15, 16. The heroes then would have been the 19-year-olds.
Yes. Yeah.
You couldn't be the hero at 15.
No.
Even if you could. By the time I was 16, 17, I was getting there.
Yeah.
I did go to the Lacy Lady, Gold Mine and all that stuff, and by the time I was 17, I was probably the best dressed guy at the Lacy Lady. But I wasn't at 15.
No.
The guys that would have been, and they was all working class boys, very much like the mod scene had been. They were all like window cleaners, plasterers, bricklayers, ordinary boys, living for the weekend.
Yeah.
That dressing up ethic, the working class.
Yeah,
let's stick with the world we know, with men. The bit we know. It's always been there, hasn't it?
Yeah,
and
sure.
I'm guessing it's never really gone away in any shape or form.
Certainly from the post-war period, but I think probably even way back to the turn of the 20th century with costermongers and everything else, that probably came from. But the funny thing is, I mean, it wasn't only in London, it was in other cities. Yes. But I certainly think London boys were always a little bit more ahead of the game. So I remember when we used to go to football when I was 8 or 9 years old, and you see the northern teams come down, and they were years behind.
Right.
In the early 70s. I remember going over West Ham when I was 11, tight Frenchy jumper, brown Oxford bags, love beads round my neck, clogs.
Details. Details.
And then smoking 10 number 6.
Of course you did.
Grown up. But the first stage for dressing up was the fairground and football.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Exactly, because you've got... I mean, that's the weird thing. You're walking around a ploughed field with stuff on that does not deserve to get muddied up, but you do.
First place you did it. It was a fun fair, or and obviously mastering all the cool moves on the Coronation Speedway. It used to go up and down, walking around in the middle when they put the strobe light on. Hold tight, hold tight, hold tight, hold tight. And I'd have a little cool walk there.
You also did Sunday best with the older chaps, the dads and the uncles.
Well, that was the Sunday best
That
thing.
Sunday thing, that was massive,
Well,
wasn't
that was the other thing, everyone goes on about the Cray thing, but all our uncles dressed like that.
Everyone,
all men dressed up,
really
and all
smart
dressed up at weekends.
Yep.
So there was that side as well. I mean, my parents were quite old, in comparison to a lot of the other kids' mums, But I was still the first kid to have long hair. I was still the first guy to have loafers, the first guy to have tonics, all that stuff. But obviously there were kids that dressed very, very well that were a couple of years older, and then of course they wanted to be mates with you.
Yeah.
Because you did dress, and that's when you really started to realise the power of
Would you take
dress.
your risk then? Would you take a few risks to be that?
Well, I was talking about someone the other day. The other thing is, up to about 12, 13, you're being like the rest of them.
Yeah.
Then you want to go ahead.
To separate yourself.
And I never felt worried about, look at him.
No.
I knew that was a good reaction.
Yeah.
If they were like, look at that, look at he's doing that. Especially when I remember I had my first pair of peg trousers in 1975. They was all laughing.
Yeah.
Everyone was wearing ridiculous wide flares, etc., which we all know the story because it's all part of that era. To
the point where I always said this is I know that we went to there was a pub that we would go to before we went on to say the Lazy Lady. And a couple of the boys would wear their flares over the top of their straight legs or their Smith carpenters because they were worried about the reaction in the boozer.
Ain't that crazy?
It doesn't make.
I didn't give a damn. I went
sense.
down in the Woolpack and Romford, the terrible pub, but it was the cheapest pint. When you're that young, you want the place we can get by the cheapest pint. Pint, don't you? So the Woolpack was the cheapest pint in those days, probably about 20p or something, 15p a pint. It was a rough and ready pub.
Yeah.
It was a rough pub, but I never worried about that stuff.
That's great.
I could always look after myself. I was always quite confident physically. I never worried, and I always had a good mind. So if someone fronted me, I was always comfortable. I'd make most of them back down.
Good, and long may it rain. Okay, if we take this as an example here, the suit you're wearing, have you, or did you settle in the early days on an era or a look or a sort of an iconic figure you thought, I'm emulating that period?
No, it's very interesting. I always think it was important when I was younger to get the look of the period right. Whether you're doing a 40s, 50s, 60s, 30s, 20s, whatever you were doing, you had to get the look completely right. But I think over the years, I've sort of owned the looks, I do.
Yeah.
So I can take different looks and different eras and play around with them and make them look contemporary and current. I think I'm more obsessed with that now. I mean, I often don't wear a shirt and tie now. I wear polo necks a lot more.
Right.
Because it takes a little bit more away. I wear trainers sometimes, all that. I mean, I used to have one of those ridiculous shoe range.
Yes.
But nowadays, I often rock a pair of
trainers. Made me cough then. The word trainer made me cough.
I think that was an accident.
I think you made it on purpose.
The point is, with the trainer, it's just making things not modern and current.
Yes.
And looking, I always want to be accepted and embraced by young people. And that's what happens. People always go, you look super stylish. I went out on Sunday, just going out with Claire Louise, my partner. We were going to have something to eat at Incognito around the corner. And, 3 or 4 compliments. Every day I always get compliments. And I haven't got to really dress up. It's also now I play with casual clothing. As you know, I've got a lot of stuff from places like Adret. I'll mix them in. I think, and also I can pick up things from, like Zara. If you know what you got in your eye, you can pick things out. You don't always have to spend silly money. Or Uniqlo. Socks are from Uniqlo.
Yes.
Boxer shorts are
Big fan of Uniqlo.
Knitwear, all my polo necks are from there, So, you don't have to always buy expensive. But going back to, we've actually gone a bit round the other side.
I never expected that.
But the point is, when you're talking about when you're young, I was taking influence from what I could buy and then being different. But when I couldn't find them, I would then go to my tailor and have things made. And that became quite easy to do, I mean,
is that a local tailor? Local.
There was a local tailor that I had with D&G Tailor. It was more like an old school East End tailor where they used to build the suits like armour, like they suits to Cradle with the shoulders and the padding. They were so structured. But they used to have a lovely book in there, which funnily enough reminds me of this book, which is worth a lot of money, which is an old Italian tailoring illustration book.
Right.
But he had one of these wonderful 60s ones in the book. So I could pick things out from that, you know, and...
I guess you were a bit of a rare commodity in a shop like that, weren't you, from the usual clientele?
Oh, for sure.
Yes.
For sure. And also a rare commodity with all my other school friends. You know, I remember all the girls loved me, but then when I started wearing peg trousers and stuff, it was too much for a lot of them.
Too radical.
Yeah, it was too radical.
Too far, mate. You went too far.
Well, that was, I guess that's kind of club culture. That's club culture coming into play there, isn't it?
Well,
because of course, this all ties in with your world, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course it does. Because obviously, after having the stage of the fun fair and the football, the youth club was the thing, and then of course graduating from the youth club when you're about 15 to go to proper nightclubs, which you meant to be 18, 19, but luckily, this is what always makes me laugh, how people put down Essex, you know, in the modern context, it being a naff, uncool place. You know, there was an amazing club scene, as you know, in Essex at that time, which is, you know, been pretty well documented in recent years, but a lot of people still don't understand it because there's two phases of it. There is the sort of wedge, belt dangling, sort of like cowboy jean, 1979 soul boy.
Yeah.
And then there's a very cool, edgy, but then the early soul boy, really, the look, when you look at Smith jeans, when you look at Winklepickers, it was stuff that you could find in second-hand.
Totally.
And basically, if you watch Summer Holiday, we shouldn't say Clifford, but if you saw Summer Holiday, a lot of the clothing they wear in that movie is the sort of clothing that we were starting to wear. Even the sort of cap-sleevey shirts and bottoms. It's all very like late 50s, early 60s looking stuff. But that was again because it would have looked so radical connected to what dandy style had become. Because by the time, there's a book they did called Peacock and Dandies.
Yeah.
By the time you get to 1976, Morecambe and Wise are wearing suits with flares and big ties and everything else. So that became filtered right down to everyone. It became the sort of norm to be like that and have a lavender shirt on and a big collared shirt and a big knock.
We talk about this all the time. Is second hand, I think particularly when we were starting shopping, is going to be your first refuge because as you say, because people weren't making it, or if they were, I remember distinctly the first time I walked into Anthony Price on the King's Road, assuming I'm going to see some clothes, and instead just seeing some patterns, panicking and turning around because I can't afford to buy it.
It was quite a clever concept he had there with that shop, wasn't it?
No, scary is what it was, Mark.
But that was another thing that always went with the old boutique thing, going back to John Stephen or even back to Vince, the original, you know, when you read all these, because Vince is someone that fascinates me as a sort of unsung hero in really this whole area.
I say he was in Newburgh, wasn't he?
He was in Newburgh, he was down the road. In fact, it was me that told Shaftesbury, the landlords, about Vince. Yeah. And then they put a blue plaque up for him about 6-7 years ago. But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very.
That was a guy called Bill Green, wasn't it? Bill Green.
Bill Green, his name was, and basically Bill Green was, you know, doing a lot of the continental clothing that men were wearing in the 50s. He was doing leather trousers, but basically his story how he started was brilliant. He started off doing naked portraiture of men, and then he wasn't allowed to shoot them naked anymore, so he customised underwear and put them in tight underwear. Which then he thought, actually, this interest started a man order business doing.
This is an unusual route for a business, isn't it?
Well, this is actually the route.
This is the start of it. This is the real Carnaby Street.
Madness.
So by 1955, you'd have people like, by the late 50s, you'd have someone like Pablo Picasso buying a pair of leather trousers there, or David Frost. And then the young kids would have gone there. In fact, John Stephen actually worked for.
Wow, there you go. So that's.
But by the 60s, he was sort of went into obscurity, but you know, because by then John Stephen had half the shops more or less on Carnaby Street.
Right.
But you know, that's another story. But that is the beginning of how this area started. And I'm probably the last thing here that's why it comes around, because it always comes back to me, as it would do. On the last thing here that represents what men's fashion, the boutique. Contemporary
last man standing.
It's an interesting point, and obviously, we'll get to that. That 40 years thing, we're definitely going to get to that part of it. But I'm still intrigued. Just as shopping, were you a good shopper? Did you enjoy the experience? Because again, that kind of idea that men aren't meant to go out and like that.
No, but my sister used to go and get a lot of my stuff because I was a bit shy and embarrassed about going in there with Provident checks, which were, remember Provident checks?
No, I never had the pleasure, I don't think.
Well, Provident checks, they were pretty skinny. But the joke is, it was just like a credit card, really. But the Provident man or lady would come down and collect the money. You were given these, 20 quid every 6 months or 30 quid. And then I'd go with that. There's only certain shops did property checks. And
right.
The shop I used to go to called Granditors, which was a really cool shop at the time. You know, I'm about 12, 13, 14. But my sister used to go and do it, and then I'd tell her what I wanted her to get me. And she used to do a great job with that. But I used to go with my mum when I was really young, but then by the time you're 11, you don't want to be seen going shopping with your mum.
No.
Going to the supermarket with your mum. No. Even though I was very close to my mum. I had an image to keep up with the girls and everything else.
Naturally. Markets.
Yeah, well,
Did you like, because markets were a good hunting ground, I think.
Well, actually, Brick Lane was the obvious one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Petticoat Lane, that was
Brick
always
Lane,
good.
yeah.
I mean, like, you know, Blackman's obviously
definitely.
being there. But funny enough, I got my first loafers from your neck of the woods, from East Street, Woolworth.
Oh yeah, East Street Market.
East
Yeah,
Lane.
yeah,
I got
East Lane.
I got my first Frank
Because you got a
White
South
loafers.
London history,
Connection,
didn't
I was born there.
Yeah,
and,
I always
I
loved
didn't
this.
actually
I've always-
spend much time over
No,
south.
you got out sharpish, didn't you, Mark?
No, I'm not in all that south.
No, I know.
But my mum was an East End person. My dad was actually from Bellingham,
Oh, wow.
so he was a South Londoner.
Yeah.
And you know, he boxed for Catford, and all my dad's family were very good boxers, ABA standard boxers. You know,
Well, that market-
Powell was a very good boxer.
That market, East Lane Market, back then, 60s, 70s,
Yeah.
was absolutely thriving. You
Well,
could
there
get some
was-
really good stuff down there.
That was a great market.
Really
and it was
good
very,
stuff,
in fact, it was almost less commercial than Petticoat Lane.
Definitely,
Yes.
definitely.
But there were a couple of little gems
There
around
was.
Petticoat Lane where you could find, you know, second-hand stuff. In fact, my ex-wife Maxine, who was a very stylish lady, was another big influence on my early part of my creative process of finding
Yes.
myself with what I did. She used to find this amazing shop on Wentworth Street and just had a full of original 40s shoes and 50s shoes. They were incredible for women.
Do
And,
you
know,
do
so-
that? I mean, we're gonna in the second part of our interview, which will come out pretty soon, actually. Say like Paul Smith or Nigel Caborn, I know, famous for it. Are you kind of still an eternal hunter? Do you like to kind of forage to see if you can find an old bit?
I can't bear the smell of second-hand clothes. I've got OCD, so I can't bear anything like that. I can't bear that musty, horrible smell. They can't get rid of it, any of that, because it's the dead cells and that getting.
Is
clothing,
it?
Yeah.
Dead man's
Oh,
clothing.
thanks for making it sound more disgusting than I thought
Dead
it
man's
was.
clothing, yeah.
Well, well,
So I can't bear
In
that.
more
So,
ways than one.
But, you know, even in my story, it played a big part. But even what was lovely about Powell and Co. were the suits, were original suits never worn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what made them
Remember
really
reading that.
unique. You know,
Remember
whether they were
reading
30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s. You know.
Did you was Mark Powell doing Mark Powell stuff before you became Soho Mark Powell, as it were?
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
From there about 18,
Right.
I started going to tailors and making like period style suits and having looks. I saw a lot of the stuff you'd have seen in me 17, 18.
Yeah.
Of course. And then what happened? People keep asking where you get your clothes.
Well,
Right.
It's always
And
that.
then you think, well, actually, I could make a living.
There's always
doing
that,
this.
isn't it? There's always
But I
that.
did have a good menswear background. I started as Savile Row in an hairdresser's when I was 16.
Did ya?
I worked for a company called Main Line. But somewhere along the line, I'd gone around the corner and I ended up working for a shop called Washington Tremlett. And that was next to Anthony Sinclair, who'd done the conduit cut.
Yeah.
So I used to go in there, spend hours in there. And I, you know, from very young age, I knew how to measure and fit a suit,
Yeah.
which is the most important part, really.
Totally.
Without being snobby, you know, go, well, you don't make it. But the point is, no one who is the creative icon of the thing normally does. They might
No.
do cutting at the most, but they don't. And I've never professed to do that. But you are still the overseer of the whole thing. I measure and fit a suit far better than any of my tailors that have ever worked for me.
Brilliant. That's the way it works.
And I've got no disrespect for the incredible craft and skill of tailoring, but I've never sort of preached about the skill of the cut, the way things are made, because my thing's always been led more by the style aspect.
Totally.
Definitely.
And that's the important thing for me.
Definitely.
The idea of a suit being a way of expressing individual style.
And you arriving in Soho as that guy is a unique experience.
Yeah.
Is the very thing that we're going to pick up on when we rejoin Mr. Mark Powell here on his 40th anniversary in the basement of his lovely shop in Newburgh Street for part 2 of our conversation.